very familiar because a whole generation of French people have been literally taught libertarianism from the works and publications of Henri Lepage, Tomorrow Capitalism and Tomorrow Liberalism, which were bestsellers in the 80s and in France. I know that when I was sort of, 18, uneducated, and I was a liberal, a classical liberal, completely utopian. Later on, I became a realist and I became an anarcho-capitalist in the sense that what Henri Lepage's book taught me is that if you have a government, it will grow. And the only way to stop it growing is to not have one. But there is another reason why I would like to mention Henri Lepage here, is that this is an ICL conference. And Henri Lepage is the only person who attended the very first ICL conference in Zurich in 1982. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Henri Lepage.
Good morning to all, and thank you very much to Christian Michel for his very kind words and for mentioning this event that took place in 1982. At that time, it was not yet ISIL, that was Libertarian International, and that had been created by Vince Miller, and I think we should have a thought of memory about Vince Miller, who disappeared a few years ago. And the first meeting was in Switzerland. So thank you very much, Christian, to give me the opportunity to be back in Switzerland 21 years later. I'm going to talk about something very different from the previous speakers. Let me check how does it work. On which, where is it? Where do I have to click? I have to hold it which way?
This one.
This one. It never works when I...
Yeah.
Okay. And so the other...
Okay, you have to...
So I'm going to talk about an economic topic, why central banks are failing the economic recovery. Yeah, I hope you will not mind me reading the paper. We have a very tight schedule. And so it's rather sometimes a difficult and technical topic, and it's better for me to read. And I'll try to read as slowly as possible so that everybody can understand. So over the last 4 years, the post-Great Recession economic recovery has been disappointingly slow, much slower than is usual during after recessions upturns. In the US, for example, there is a persisting nominal GDP gap of about 10%, which this graph makes the point. Unemployment data, it is even worse in Europe. Unemployment data support the common popular feeling that we have not yet moved out of the crisis. So why is it so? To that question, there are 4 main types of answers. The first one is what I call the Bernanke conventional response. That is, well, there is yet no ground to claim that our policy is a failure. Let's have more of the same, and it will finish by paying off. Meaning, no worry, we are anyway heading in the right direction. Then you have the second one you are familiar with too, which is the Keynesian critique. We went too far. How do I get back to the... How put back to the first ones? Okay. So that's the Bernanke conventional response. The Keynesian critique, and of course you know the name of Paul Krugman or Stiglitz. Quantitative easing policies go the right way, but economic policy will be more efficient if central banks were allowed to directly finance public deficits through direct purchases of treasury bonds or treasury securities, rather than relying on the private bank's reserve transformation mechanism for expanding monetary supply. It is imperative to put an end to all public austerity programs, and we'll speak more about it with our friend this afternoon, and increase public investment in order to kickstart faster economic growth. Then, the third type of that is the new monetarist explanation, associated with the name of Scott Sumner. Common to what they say the following: contrary to common belief, and despite multiple quantitative easing operations, post-recession monetary policy has been over-restrictive, thus putting a check on recovery. But they continue. Quantitative easing policy, we should continue them so as to steer up higher inflation expectations. So, curiously enough, the new monetarists end up joining the Keynesians. The fourth one, what I call the QE skeptics analysis. So I belong to a group of global warming skeptics. And so you also have the QE skeptics. That is the idea that present macroeconomic policy, quantitative easing plus near zero interest rate policy, defeats its own goals by multiple effects that play against economic recovery. And that is what I want now to focus on. So what is wrong with quantitative easing? The skeptics' argument may be listed under 4 arguments, 4 headings. Sorry. So the skeptics' arguments may be listed under 4 headings. The first one is that the truth about QE is that it is indeed, in reality, a bureaucratic credit allocation scheme. If Milton Friedman had been in command, his response would most likely have come in the form of a general, untargeted, massive liquidity injection through regular open market operations. But under Bernanke, Fed interventions went on a very different path. What has been set up is a complex and sophisticated multi-channel bailing out system whose specificities have been little publicized. Basically, its concern is not regulation of money supply using market instruments, but directly channeling liquidity to key financial intermediaries whose failure, as decided by the Fed bureaucracy, will create massive disruptions in the intermediation chain, what we call the too big to fail. To that purpose, the Fed resorts to an array of ad hoc specific programs and financial tools aiming at different categories of intermediaries, dealers, investment banks, mutual funds, who receive money that has been mainly borrowed by the central bank. That's something which I discovered. They receive money that has been mainly borrowed by the central bank in order to be directly allocated by the Fed's bureaus. But as they do mainly use borrowed money, these operations lead to a huge increase in the bank balance sheet without adding much to base money. So the end result is that Bernanke did change the basic nature of his establishment, adding to the central bank traditional function of simply manipulating the money supply, the function of centrally allocating credit. Most of it is indeed borrowed. The Fed thus has morphed into what George Selgin calls rightly a central planning agency. That's something which is very little known. We all believe that they create only money, that they create money. In fact, they don't create so much money. My second heading is what I call the Fed carry trade bubble. A major feature of QEs is a pre-announced commitment by the central bank to maintain its near zero interest rate policy over a long undetermined period of time. Few people remember that the first time the Fed resorted to such a device antedates Bernanke's appointment. It dates back to the summer of 2003, when the Fed, under Greenspan chairmanship, officially committed itself to keeping interest rates low for a considerable period of time. This decision radically changed the set of incentives that determines the working of the US financial system. It made it more profitable for operators to speculate by borrowing as short term as possible, even overnight, and investing in longer duration safe securities, using leverage to compensate for their lower returns. Institutions that used to shun balance sheet risk, such as pension funds, reversed course and began to engage in carry trade activities, borrowing short term to invest in securitization, using the language of the carry trade was usually applied to dealing with currencies. Well, we can apply it to investing in your own country. The system became a sort of gigantic carry trade bubble arena fueled by the Fed new strategy. But to the monetary authorities, and that's very important, such developments were no cause for alarm, since they delivered precisely what they were looking for: low interest rates, even at the longer range, so as to win their fight against what was then mistakenly considered as a pressing threat of deflation. I would need to develop, but we may come back later on this point. By changing its strategy, the Fed has had in effect enabled a long chain of events and reactions that led to generalized over-leveraging and ultimately ended in the great banking panic of 2008. They did engineer the bust. It's a Fed's policy, the Fed's mistake. However, this is not the end of the story. By promising to hold rates close to zero and engaging in QE, it appears that the post-recession Fed did learn little from the unintended and unfortunate consequences of its past policy. It has been implicitly acting as if it wanted to enable again a burgeoning carry trade activity. But in a new environment, where the great factory for providing a growing and wide supply of arbitrage instruments such as securitized products, CDOs, and other sophisticated products had been dismantled. The consequence has been a growing scarcity of safe assets used as collateral that are necessary for bringing the interbank market back to life and resurrecting an active bank loan activity. Such a scarcity, by raising the price of collateral, holds back growth recovery by increasing the price of collateral and thus credit costs to the economy. The third heading, Basel III and the role of regulation. Basically, the function of quantitative easing is to make up for the huge destruction of private money that resulted when trillions of dollars of collateral assets exchanged on the banking and shadow banking markets disappeared almost overnight. Over the last 20 years, there has been a major change in Western monetary institutional framework. Base money, that is, money directly issued by central banks or state money, accounts now for no more than a very tiny fraction of money supply. For example, in 2007, base money accounted only for 6.5% of money supply at large, what we call M4 in the US. This means that in modern economies, the supply of money is now mainly private and is the product of market forces. More than 90% of additions to the money stock are supplied via a double multiplier mechanism. The traditional banking multiplier that works on deposit, that everybody knows about, but also that is less known, but also the new shadow banking multiplier, about 4 times, that results from repo hypothecation practices. That's a very sophisticated name. While most people assume that with zero interest rate policy and massive bailout assets purchases, central bank printing presses are again working full speed, such a large ratio between base money and money at large explains why actual post-recession monetary policy remained and remains unexpectedly and deceptively far tighter than commonly assumed. It is just a matter of mere simple arithmetics, not even mathematics. The Fed may double its yearly supply of new base money every year, which may look rather big, yet these additions will only have a small and slow incremental effect on the growth of the overall stock of money. Even after 4 years of QEs, US state money, for example, still accounts for a little more than 16% of the stock of money. So we believe that they are creating a lot of money, that QE is about creating a lot of money, which is not true. Monetary tightness is compounded by the fact that at the same time, under the guise of making the banking and financial system more secure, central bank authorities are busy at implementing new bureaucratic regulations. Basel III, big thing. Deleveraging is the normal course of action for banks and financial institutions eager to restore a safer balance sheet after a recession. However, this post-recession deleveraging process has been exacerbated by a politically motivated, frenzied campaign led by some Western government leaders, such as the British, supported by central bankers to enforce new compulsory tighter capital ratios. When private money accounts for almost 90% of money stock, such a regulation forced extra deleveraging, supplementary deleveraging, and it can easily translate into a massive negative multiplier effect that nullifies central banks' efforts to accelerate overall money growth through incremental base money accretions. And according to our friend Professor Steve Hanke, this is precisely what happened. And it explains the continuing deflationary effect on the economy. As a matter of fact, the central bank lost effective control of money supply. It may recover it later, but for quite a number of years, it has little control of the effective money supply. Now for my fourth heading, what I call a vicious circle. More fundamentally, basic microeconomic theory teaches that near-zero rate policy acts very much like a price ceiling in a housing rental market where landlords react by reducing the supply of rental apartments. That's, traditional basic price microeconomic theory. While borrowers benefit from it, lenders supply less credit at the lower rate. The decline in credit availability creates a lasting environment of credit crunch, which may look strange when they are supposed to create much money. Money keep flowing, but to large corporate businesses that are too big to fail, look back to my first point, and benefit from direct financial support. while small businesses fall victims of insidious credit rationing. However, in a deadly vicious circle, the harmful effects of these interventions then are used as an excuse to justify greater reliance on direct administrative allocative tools such as those developed by the Fed under Bernanke. Finally, 5 years after the crash, the same causes, that is near-zero interest rate policy and its consequence, the carry trade effect, are bringing the same consequences, distorting, as before the recession, distorting risk perception, causing bubbles, malinvestment, market signal discoordination, and so on. You see, Bernanke said, well, we won't do the same mistake as they did in the 30s. Well, he did it. He did it in the beginning in 2006. And he has made it again after the recession. Finally, my fifth point, the exit issue. So I asked the question, why such a deceptive recovery? We now have the explanation. A major central bank management failure was the root cause of the big crash and the Great Recession that followed. Another and largely similar central bank failure has failed the recovery. Where does this lead us to? The very same policy that led to the big bubble and crash and then failed the recovery is also making exit from QE very risky and difficult, and even, I would say, impossible. The reason comes from the new incentive structures generated by the Fed forward guidance policy. These incentives are heavily sensitive to any change in the expected future interest rates path. If that path unexpectedly changes, or if that path unexpectedly departs from its pre-announced course, it may rapidly kickstart another full-fledged financial crisis and deflationary bust by inducing a reversal of previous investment strategies that ends up in a mess of discoordinated reactions. And this is precisely the type of alert that occurred very recently following the declarations of Fed members about QE tapering and quickly led them to retreat. Theoretically, it is possible for central bankers to manage such a sensitive transition and to prevent uncontrolled interest rate hikes. But it would imply such an incredible fine-tuning capacity and communicating ability that may be assumed in abstract policy models such as those developed by a BIS expert, the Bank of International Settlements in Geneva, not far from here, but much more difficult to apply in the real world of incomplete and uncertain information. And then, given the past 10 years' experience and the Fed's record of repeated policy failures, I ask you, can we still trust these men and naively bank on their skills to manage such tricky situations? Well, personally, I do seriously doubt it, and I hope you do too. Consequently, that's very important, even if QE strategy were to be successful, let's imagine that magically it succeeds in reviving consumers and investors' animal spirits, like the Canadians like to put it. A quiet and peaceful transition from QE and conventional policies back to monetary normality looks most unlikely. Two outcomes, then, are evenly possible. First, a new systemic financial bust with another banking panic. I think we are really heading this way, leading to maybe to economic collapse. Or a second possibility, a rush into runaway inflation. Or the two, maybe the two combined. That's possible. The only thing we know, as confirmed by a recent academic study, is that hyperinflation probability, that's really, we must seriously think about it, is closely related with the US government ability to urgently enforce a very severe fiscal consolidation policy over the coming years. Not in 10 years, in the next 3 to 4 years. Do in the States what they are trying to do in Greece. That's applied to Europe in the same way. So I ask you, is it politically feasible? Well, I'll let then everyone take his bet. How much? I still have a word. It may look like a conclusion, but I still have a conclusion. Then, how much confidence can we still place in people to keep accumulating such mistakes? Are they just regretful random accidents, or do they reveal more systematic fundamental flaws? As it becomes clearly apparent when you read non-conventional accounts of the Fed's history. I mentioned, articles or papers written by Selgin, Driscoll, Horvitz, or Krosner, who has been the governor of the Fed, but who wrote a beautiful article about the beginnings of the Fed back in the 20s. I think that more than ever before, time is ripe for questioning the action and the raison d'etre of central banking. And beyond the central bank itself, for questioning the monetary regime that legitimates its existence. That is the regime of fiat money based on a fractional reserve banking system lacking market-based feedback mechanisms. Learning about the true story of recent central bank failures offers a favorable opportunity, and then I'm addressing the Austrian economist, offers a favorable opportunity for resurrecting an active debate about the future of central banking and the possibility of alternate monetary regimes. It also brings about a great opportunity for popularizing the more radical Austrian critique of macroeconomics. Well, it is just a scientific illusion. Critique of macroeconomic policy. It can only hamper the adjustment process and transfer resources necessary for a modern economy to keep growing. And final, central banking, that is the true root cause of booms and busts. Thank you. I'm sorry. I forgot to look.
Thank you very much, Henri. I applauded a bit early because I was distressed with the conclusion that you had reached at that point. But I'm pleased that we ended up on a tone of, well, there is another way, Austrian economics, let's try that one. So
exactly.
It's good to end up on an upbeat note. Stay here because we are going to have a discussion. I'm going to clear the mess I've made on this desk. And we are going to have a discussion with the speakers of this morning and with the audience. So, gentlemen. So it's a collective Q&A. So I invite you to ask questions, make comments, and I will ask the speakers of this morning to interact between themselves if they have questions to each other and with yourselves. And we'll do this to whet our appetite before lunch. Over to you. Questions to any of the speakers of this morning? Or to, yes, gentleman there in green. Dan Mitchell, actually.
This is for Henri, but if anybody else wants to jump in, feel free to. What do you think of the assertion that, well, the financial crisis, the recession we just went through was a balance sheet recession, and those just take a lot longer to recover from? And that's all that's really happening, and we shouldn't worry too much.
Well, of course, it will take much longer than everybody is expecting. That's what I precisely described and explained the causes. But then, the problem is the exit issue. You can keep on some time, but the Fed's policy is just rebuilding exactly the main situation that led to the previous crash. So the balance sheet, well, the balance sheet, whatever explanations, but balance sheet explanation is not a final explanation. You have to look to understand what are the forces and processes which are behind, or we are resurrecting exactly the same processes that led to the previous one. So I discussed with Christopher Little in the train, and he was sharing my own perception. We are rather pessimistic about what may happen. I don't believe that there is a safe issue. The only condition for having a safe issue, a safe exit, or a safe, that will be that you have in the States a very strong fiscal consolidation policy, which I don't think it's likely.
There was another gentleman next to Dan Mitchell, whose hand I'd seen before. Yes.
Thank you. Look, if you feel that the central banks are not filling their roles, with what would you replace them?
Oh, well, this is another topic for another session and another conference, and I hope we will have similar conferences on that kind of topic. That is the topic of the future. Well, I'm a believer in free banking, the type that George Selgin or Laurie White are defending, and that has been to be really discussed and documented.
Yeah, thanks. This is to Jim. Your paper is well presented, and we all realize we're supposed to conduct ourselves in a manner that others can accept what we talk about. But at what point do you think the worst ceases to be the worst when one can realize that this is the worst? You're trying to be humble, you're trying to pass your message, but at the point that you can't take it, because one thing stand, the same blood that flows in the libertarians are the same blood that flows in other people. So we all have, in humanity, I guess you agree with me that we all have our moment of madness, just a brief one. So if that happens, we will have a lot of challenges. Take, for example, I was in a university in Africa to talk to students about the advantage of free market economy, property rights, and principle of individualism. And I wouldn't jump in from the space into the school. It was accepted I should come. But when I got there, my first contact has to be the vice chancellor. And in our discussion, because in Africa, when I operate, I don't use liberty. I tell authority, I want to talk about entrepreneurship. And at that point, they've approved, and I left Nigeria. I was in Kenya. I got to the school, the students are waiting for me. And in the office, the man realized I won't check 1 or 2 textbooks I had. And he said, sorry, we can't have you in this school. Considering the flight, the risk, and I thought of it, if it wasn't in his own environment, if it had happened outside, I would have been forced to punch him. At that point, what will you advise? Because fine, we're supposed to be at the best of our humility when we are discussing with others. But we're human beings as well. When it gets to a point, what will you advise we do? Thank you.
Knock him out. No, my crystal ball was broken a long time ago. I don't know what the right answer is. I have to argue for what I think is best. At least in the United States, which is the situation with which I have the greatest familiarity, I think we still have some time and some way to go before we reach the point where we have to respond with more than just words. By the way, I'm a firm, but there are a lot of people with whom I disagree on damn near everything. As long as they're intellectually honest, as long as they're willing to take the bitter with the sweet for their own advocacy, I can have great respect for them. I may have to kill them at some point, but in that case, I won't torture them. It'll be a double tap to the head. They'll be dead. It's like the mafia. Nothing personal. It's just business. There may be a point where God forbid, there may be a point where we do have to take up arms to reclaim our liberty. By the way, I will not reach the promised land because some statist will plop a sign in the meadow saying free beer, and I'll come wandering out and will get my free beer and then be shot to little libertarian pieces. Again, you basically have to look at the situation and do the best you can. There are times where perhaps you have gone past the point where talk it's no longer appropriate. You have to take some form of more firm action. So that's all I can say. I don't know that that's very helpful.
Any comment from the room, from the panel? No? Sorry.
Yes, sometimes it's no use talking to some people, and indeed the only thing you have to do is run away or fight or flight. At other times, you are talking for the audience. You're not talking really to the person who you're confronting, but you're talking to the spectators. And sometimes there are no spectators, and there's only the evil guy, and then there's not much to do.
I wonder if Henri has some ideas as to how we might preserve our assets or perhaps increase them with in the near future in the event that he thinks things are likely to go in the next few years.
Well, I told you what is my feeling. Now it's up to you to tell me what I have to do in such circumstances. I'm not a banker nor a somebody working in financial services.
Ken over there.
I'd like to tie together the comments from both, from all three of you, actually. You've talked about competition being an excellent opportunity to show a good path, and the crisis that is not only in the United States but Europe here in the central banking systems. What's the likelihood that the European Union or the Eurozone under the European Central Bank might crack and break up at some point? Some part of Europe might accept free banking and show us out of the sea of darkness into the light.
Well, to try, this is also a crystal ball issue, but I think there is some chance that the Eurozone will break up, not so much because the smaller subsidized countries in Southern Europe will get fed up with the rules imposed on them by Brussels and the IMF and so on, but because the northern countries might get fed up with subsidizing those countries, and I'm thinking of Germany, of the Netherlands, and others. And I hope they would. And we see now right now a debate on for example in Germany, of economists very skeptical of the euro arrangement and calling for a change and for a return to something more sound in terms of monetary arrangement. I don't think that the answer will be free banking, but it will be something that is less perverse than the current arrangement, and I think that would already be some progress. I think we at least the discussion is moving in that direction, and as we know, it takes some time before it filters down the political decision making. But I mean, in the debate, at least, we see some movement. And but I'm afraid we still need to increase our educational effort to make sure that free banking and Austrian solutions that Henri mentioned will become more prevalent. But you know, again, being involved in the German-speaking debate, I see in Germany especially a number of very competent economists, Misesian economists, Austrian economists, that have a really front presence in the debate in the main newspapers, and so there is some hope that something will happen.
Well, you know, concerning the euro, there is a very basic technical failure that has been done at the very beginning, before at the time of treaty, that makes the Eurozone unworkable. It cannot work in a fine way. But that does not mean that the euro is going to break up tomorrow, because the politicians are dead fixed on this idea that the euro must survive. So they are ready to impose all the costs as very, very, very high price on the European citizens for keeping the euro in the system. And I'm sure that they are going to impose a very, very high cost. That is for sure. Now, what personally I feel that we must prepare ourselves for a purgatory. Free market people, for purgatory, and also as citizens, a purgatory of about 15 years. We are going to live through a period that is dominated by what Bernanke is beginning in the States, and that we are doing also that is called financial repression. That is a move backward. We had the deregulation of liberal revolution that started with Reagan, that's been going on for 30 years, and now we are in such dead-end position. There is no exit from. We are caught up in such conflicting forces that there is no way to get out safely from that. So we have to prepare for 30 years. And now, is the euro going to survive or not? Well, it's like, is there going to be a revolution in France or in Greece or in Spain, anywhere else? You are in such a configuration of a situation that anything can pop up at any time. And that's really the period when we cannot use the crystal ball, but we will be able to see nothing.
Just a quick comment that actually does apply somewhat to the discussion here. A principle of biology that I think is very important is that good parasites learn not to kill their hosts. Particularly virulent strains of venereal disease, for example, died out because they killed the people that had them. We've seen plenty of situations going back to the NEP in Soviet Russia, to the liberalization in the United States, where eventually once the parasites realize that the organism is starting to die, they realize, gee whiz, we're not going to have a host. So it's not at all unusual for people to get mugged by reality and say, we have to withdraw, we have to make changes. And those changes are basically for their survival. I'll also add another point. Crashes, catastrophes, are pretty damn costly. And even the bastards that cause them have incentives to try to pull back at the last minute. And I mention this because I've heard all manner of people saying that we're going to have a crash, we're going to have a catastrophe. This has been going on for a long time. It's a remarkable sign of just how productive capitalist systems are, that they're managed to continue to crank out wealth despite the extraordinary degree of regulation that are placed upon them. So I don't know. Again, my crystal ball broke a long time ago. I think that Henri Lepage is absolutely correct that we're going to be in for some tough times. Whether or not we're going to see a collapse, I don't know. Prediction is hard, particularly when it concerns the future.
Yeah, coming back to the quantitative easing, what we see now is enormous wealth transfer from savers to debtors. And this is a slow motion crash. It is undermining the savers' assets with about 4% a year. And people are not very clever calculating interest on interest. So it will take time, but we can see now, for example, latest Forza poll in Germany, that the German population in general are very worried about the purchase power of their savings. And there is even a trend that people are consuming more because they said, better I buy a new car now because in 3 years' time I might not be able to do that. So there is, in the German political debate, it is like they have dragged the people and put it on ice. But under the surface, according to the Forza I read this morning, there is really a rising worry. And one day it will explode when the middle class understand that they have been ripped off with 20% of their pension savings. And we know from history, when the middle class feel that they have been robbed of their savings, they create a situation of political instability. Do you see that we will get, we can say, awful new political moments, the absolute opposite to liberal the next years?
Well, what you're describing is just what I call financial repression. Yeah. And that was the financial regime after the war that dominated for 15 years after the war. So that's what we are very likely heading to. Now, what you say, that's possible for the Germans. We want to withdraw because if the euro breaks, that will be by withdrawal by the Germans, not the Mediterranean countries that will withdraw. That's the only technically that there is a technical possibility, and even on a legal basis, the Germans have a good case that they could make it. But will they do it? That we are back to the crystal ball.
And Moe after that. Sorry, this has to do with the Eurozone, European Union. Part of the things which is quite challenging to us that talks about this in Africa is some bright student read some of the things you discuss about Eurozone and European Union, and probably challenge us as well, stating the fact that when we talk about free movement. We use Europe as an example of the movement of a citizen from Germany to Spain, Spain to Poland, Poland to Finland, without visa. Yet, libertarians are talking about Eurozone, European Union not working. So basically, in Europe, you've not been doing enough to separate the movement vis-a-vis the economic policies. Fusion of the economic policy of European countries and the movement of the people. Because in Africa, it is easier for me in Nigeria to trade with somebody in Britain than to trade with somebody beside my country, which is Republic of Benin. So if libertarians in Africa are arguing against the borders, then they see Europe arguing against the European Union. They're not seeing it from the economic perspective. So this is like an advice for the libertarians who talk more about the dysfunctionality of the European Union to separate the political movement from the economic implication of trying to fuse the entire European Union together. Because it poses a lot of challenges to us if you are a guard to free movement, which we use in telling people that if I bring out my passport, they're like Bible. And what you find there are African visas. When in Europe, you can actually cross any border with just an ID card. So when we are talking about disadvantage of that, some young chaps are reading more of the discussion on euro. So it's like an advice when you're discussing that in an international conference like this, there should be separations and things like that. That this is equally an advantage. Just like what Jim has said, that when we talk about government, it is not that we should have a blanket condemnation, because some of us benefit from and some of us really worked in the government, and that is why some knew much about government policies which are bad, and they are able to bring it out to all of us. Thank you.
May I respond very quickly? I do not dispute the benefits of the euro. For 7 years, I lived in Brussels as an international bureaucrat. I worked for the European Parliament. And I must say, the first year I moved to Brussels, every weekend I would go home. And at that time, I needed to have francs, and to have French francs and Belgian francs. So as an international bureaucrat, I was very happy when the euro was created, because then I had no more problem. It was fantastic for me. And that's fantastic for many people. But beware. There is a basic flaw in the mechanisms of the euro that dates back to the very creation of the system. If you don't correct it, and nobody wants to acknowledge it, but the Germans with Hans Werner Sinn, yes, really seen what it's a very basic feedback mechanism that can be easily corrected, but nobody wants, because bureaucrats are very proud of what they have done. The treaty is a treaty, that's forever. It's just a very small thing to correct. But if they don't correct it, and they are, hardcore, based on them, we keep it, then the cost of those benefits which you are benefiting today, the cost tomorrow will be absolutely fantastic in terms, not only in economic terms, because you may have disruption and so on. The crisis is worse in Europe than in the States, but also in political cost, because you may have an unexpected upsurge, revolutionary upsurge somewhere and so on. So beware. You are right, but beware.
The European Union is like a two-headed monster, but and there's always been since the beginning a tension between two visions: a social democratic vision and a liberal vision for Europe. I think the four freedoms of the Treaty of Rome were certainly a good thing, but that's basically a case for free trade, free movement of people, free movement for capital, for goods and services. But you don't need an international organization for that. You just need to get rid of the borders and the controls and the tariffs. And basically, you can say that European liberty or the freedoms that are associated with the European Union are just something that you can implement by getting rid of the obstacles to trade and to the free movement of people. You don't need an organization for that. And so when you, from an African perspective, if you look at the European Union, just look at the case for free trade. And I think it's very dangerous when you start liberalizing from the top. That is to say, to build an organization and say we are going to liberalize from the top, because then you will have a dynamic an internal dynamic for more bureaucracy, for rules and regulations, and for centralization. So I would separate the issue of the organizations, of the institutions of the European Union, and look at the good things that are universal, free trade and free movement of people and so on.
I'd like to offer a comment that differs slightly from my colleagues. In the United States, many people of libertarian disposition who look at our federal system, the Constitution, they complain with great justice about how things have deteriorated, say, going back to the Civil War, how things have deteriorated since, say, 100 years ago when we had the Federal Reserve Act passed, we had the income tax passed. And people who are making these comments are absolutely right. But David Bose of the Cato Institute likes to point out, well, if you're an African American and you're constantly hearing, white people complain about how things have gone to hell in this country, their perspective is going to be, yes, but we also have done a lot of good things with respect to personal relationships, affectional relationships. So I think Mr. Thomas's point is absolutely correct. When we start complaining about the problems, we must be attentive to the fact that, again, many of these issues have multiple dimensions, and that for some people, the things that we are complaining about don't necessarily resonate. There have been perhaps some progress with respect to human relations, for example, in the United States. So I think his point is a very good one. And again, it points to this issue. We have to be very careful to understand to whom we're speaking, because, again, what they hear may not have been what we said. What we say may not be what they hear.
There's Moe there, and then I'll add a quick question, and then we'll continue. Yes.
Thank you. My question is for Henri. What would you say? How would you rebuke those that say that what's failing the economic recovery?
Sorry, I don't hear you.
Can you hear me now? How would you rebuke those that say what's failing the economic recovery is a lack of fiscal policy, especially coming out in Washington, and that the Federal Reserve has, in effect, become the de facto plumber to fix the economy, which is a job they never should have had in the first place. But that since they are the only tool they do have.
Sorry, but if you could speak slowly. Okay. And wait, it's
What would you say to those that say that the failure of the economic recovery is due to a lack of fiscal policy, and that monetary policy is the de facto the only tool left to go ahead and fix the economy, and that since interest rates are already near zero, you can only use quantitative easing?
Well, we don't share the same economic paradigm. We don't share the same basic fundamentals. And you're just back to the basic dispute between the Keynesians and the fiscalists and the monetarists. And there you have to go back to empirical research. And but I belong to the group of people, along with Steve Hanke, wrote a number of pieces recently or last year on precisely that issue. That shows that anyway, monetarism is superior to fiscalism. And he has many empirical elements to prove it, and then that will be disputed by Krugman and others. Of course, that's the academic and the intellectual dispute that goes on every day, and that will never end.
I was thinking, Henri, you've mentioned there is a very small flaw right at the beginning of the euro, and I wonder what you had in mind exactly. What was this very small flaw? And I would like to put a favorable word for the euro, in the sense that I remember that when I was traveling 20, 25 years ago before the euro, everywhere I went with my French francs, I was looked at with commiseration, scorn, poor guy, what sort of currency is this? And now when I travel, I see whether it's in Brazil, whether it's in Russia, whether it's in China, they are in, with money changers, there is dollar, euro. And then there is a list of, minor currencies that are at the bottom of the list. So there is one aspect, that is this aspect that, for the first time, many individuals in Europe have a currency that actually means something, can buy something. The second thing is the fiscal discipline that the euro imposes, the Maastricht Treaty, which was not respected, is something that is what countries need, because the easy way out of devaluing your currency when you're not productive leads you nowhere. The countries that are big exporters are actually countries that have a strong currency. I mean, Germany and this country. So, and what we need in order to impose reforms on Greece, on Spain, and so on, reforms that would actually be liberal reforms in my sense, the only argument that other countries have are to say, well, if you want to stay in the euro, You have to get rid of all these civil servants, all these bloated bureaucracies, and so on. So what do you have to say to that?
Well, what you just said now, this disequilibria and these heavy costs that countries like Greece have to pay, is because the system has allowed the build-up of fundamental disequilibrium. There is a basic problem in a monetary union, which is how to accommodate differentials, growth differentials in productivity between different countries. Well, they understood that there was a problem, and when they created the Eurozone, they thought that the solution should be political. And that was the Maastricht Treaty, that was the criteria, and whenever you go, you get over the main, the basic numbers, then there will be sanctions, and but that does not work precisely because it is a political discipline. Political disciplines don't work. You always find accommodations. The French, the Germans benefited from the system, the first one, then the French ones. So because there has been no system for reacting to the basic productivity disequilibria that we are building up within the Eurozone, we left a huge problem to develop. And the big cost, political cost in terms of fiscal consolidation that we are mentioning today, it's because of that. So we have to go back to the basic treaty, to the basic model, the basic drawback. And the only person, as far as I know, that really pointed out at this problem is Hans Werner Sinn, the German economist, and he says, well, it is a problem that arises also in the States. How with such a large monetary union, that doesn't happen to the same disequilibria building up. Because maybe he's wrong, maybe I'm wrong, I don't know. But what he explains, because within the Fed system, between the federal districts, there is a system every year that when there is a payment disequilibrium between two districts, the one with was a debit position has to compensate his creditor, and there are movements, very tiny movements. These accounts used to be settled by gold certificates years ago. That has been given up. But they still have to pay something, so they pay by moving securities from one Fed district to the other one. It's not very big, but the slight difference, it's made every year, every year. So you cannot have such huge disequilibria building up in the same way that happened within the Eurozone. And I think he's right. But if you choose the political system, there is no way. I mean, and so finally, there is just one other thing I want to say in favor. The solution, because you say, well, if we create monetary national currencies, that's the end of the world. I agree, but there is a solution. Keeping the euro as a common currency, but competing with national currencies, if some people want to come back to the franc or to the Dutch mark, and so on. And so when you travel, you use the euro, when you pay your taxes, you use the French franc or the German Dutch mark. And that was the system that was the first system that they devised. And I don't remember who was the father of that idea, but that was refused by the politicians because they wanted a strong union.
I'm afraid there are other questions, but I've just been told that if we want to have seats in restaurants nearby, we have to try chasing them now because we are quite a crowd. And so we'll stop there. It was a fascinating discussion and a fascinating morning. There is a list of restaurants that has been sort of posted somewhere, and it's also in the guide that you all received. So just go to one or the other of these restaurants, form small groups, and we'll be back here at 2:00 on the dot. So